was just another Tuesday morning when Agent James walked into the Starbucks on 5th Street. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air and the place was buzzing with the usual crowd. People in business suits typing away on laptops, students with headphones buried in their books, and a few regulars chatting with the baristas like old friends. James ordered his usual. Large black coffee, no sugar, simple. He found a spot by the window, pulled out his laptop, and settled in. To anyone watching, he looked like just another guy starting his workday. Maybe a businessman, maybe a freelancer. Nobody would guess he was an FBI agent on one of the most important assignments of his career. For the past 3 months, James had been investigating a police officer named Officer Reynolds. Not just any officer. Reynolds had been on the force for 12 years, had commendations hanging on his office wall, and was respected by many of his colleagues. But James knew something else, something darker. The complaints had been piling up for years. African-American men getting pulled over for no reason. Rough treatment during arrests. Rights being ignored. The patterns were clear once you knew what to look for. One man had been arrested for looking suspicious while waiting for his daughter outside a school. Another was handcuffed for asking why he was being stopped. The stories went on and on. James had spent weeks going through body camera footage, reading incident reports, and interviewing people who'd had run-ins with Reynolds. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. This officer was targeting people based on the color of their skin. And he was getting away with it because the system protected him. Today was supposed to be simple surveillance. James knew Reynolds patrolled this area every morning. The officer usually stopped at this exact Starbucks around 9. James had been watching his patterns, documenting his routes, building a timeline. Everything had to be perfect because cases like this needed rock-solid evidence. James took a sip of his coffee and glanced at his laptop screen. He had files disguised as regular business documents, but they were actually parts of his investigation. Photos, timestamps, witness statements, all carefully hidden in plain sight. Through the window, he noticed a patrol car pulling up to the curb. Right on schedule. James didn't react. He'd been trained not to show any emotion, any recognition. He just kept his eyes on his screen, fingers moving across the keyboard like he was answering emails. Officer Reynolds stepped out of the car. Tall guy, probably in his late 30s with that walk that some cops have, the kind that says they own the street. He adjusted his belt where his gun and radio hung and headed toward the Starbucks entrance. James felt the small recording device hidden under his shirt. It was already on, had been since he left his apartment that morning. Everything was being transmitted back to his partner, who was parked 2 blocks away. This was standard procedure. Never go into potential contact situations without backup knowing exactly where you are. The door chimed as Reynolds walked in. James didn't look up. He kept his focus on the laptop, playing his role perfectly. Just another customer. Nothing special. Nothing to notice, but something felt different today. James couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way Reynolds scanned the room as he entered. Maybe it was the slight tension in his shoulders. Whatever it was, James's instincts started whispering that this morning might not go as planned. Reynolds walked to the counter, but James could feel eyes on him. That sixth sense that every agent develops. The awareness that someone is watching you even when you're not looking at them. James shifted slightly in his seat, making sure his FBI credentials were secure in his inside jacket pocket. They were there, right where they always were. But something told him he might need them sooner than expected. The barista called out an order. A woman grabbed her latte and left. A teenager scrolled through his phone while waiting. Normal morning scenes. Normal sounds. But James's heartbeat had picked up just a little. Years of training had taught him to trust these feelings. Reynolds was still at the counter, but he wasn't ordering. He was talking to someone on his radio, low enough that James couldn't hear the words, but he could see the officer's body language change. More alert, more focused, and then Reynolds turned and looked directly at where James was sitting. Their eyes met for just a second before James looked back down at his laptop. That moment stretched longer than it should have. And in that moment, James realized something had gone wrong. Somehow, some way, this routine surveillance was about to become something else entirely. Reynolds started walking toward him. Not the casual walk of someone getting their coffee and leaving. This was purposeful, deliberate. The kind of approach James had seen in dozens of body cam videos during his investigation. The kind that usually ended with someone in handcuffs. James's mind raced through possibilities. Had someone recognized him? Had there been a leak in the investigation? Was this just horrible timing? Whatever it was, the next few minutes were going to be critical. He kept his hands visible on the table, a habit from years of training. Never give anyone a reason to think you're reaching for something. Stay calm, stay professional. But inside, James knew that his carefully planned investigation was about to collide with the very behavior he'd been documenting. The other customers were starting to notice too. You could feel the shift in the room's energy, that collective awareness that something was about to happen. A woman grabbed her child's hand a little tighter. A man looked up from his phone. The barista stopped mid-pour, watching. Reynolds was 10 feet away now, then 5. His hand rested near his belt, near his weapon. Not threatening, but not casual either. It was a position of control, of authority, of power, and James, sitting there with his coffee and his laptop, was about to become the target of the exact kind of profiling he'd spent 3 months investigating. This was it, the moment where everything could either fall apart or come together in ways James never expected. He took one more sip of his coffee, set it down carefully, and prepared for whatever was about to happen next. Because one thing was certain. This Tuesday morning at Starbucks was about to become a whole lot more complicated than anyone in that room could have imagined. Officer Reynolds stood right in front of James's table now, close enough that James could see the name badge pinned to his uniform, could smell the coffee on his breath from earlier that morning. The officer's stance was wide, his shoulders squared. Everything about his body language screamed authority and control. "Sir, I need to see some identification. Right now." Reynolds' voice was loud. Louder than it needed to be in the quiet coffee shop. It was the kind of volume designed to draw attention, to establish dominance, to make someone feel small. James looked up slowly, keeping his expression neutral. This was exactly how it started in the complaints he'd read. The aggressive approach, the immediate demand. No explanation, no courtesy, just raw authority being wielded like a weapon. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" James kept his voice calm and even. He'd practiced this 1,000 times in training scenarios. Never escalate. Never give them ammunition. Stay professional no matter what. Reynolds' jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed slightly. "I asked you a question. I need to see your ID, now." Around them, the coffee shop had gone almost silent. The espresso machine had stopped hissing. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Everyone was watching now. Some people looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others pulled out their phones, not even trying to hide that they were getting ready to record. James could hear his partner's voice crackling softly in his nearly invisible earpiece. "James, what's happening?" "Talk to me," but he couldn't respond. Not here, not now. All he could do was trust that everything was being recorded, that backup was listening, that the evidence was being captured. "Officer, I'm just sitting here having coffee," James said calmly. "Can you tell me why you need to see my identification?" It was a reasonable question. A legal question. Citizens had the right to know why police were demanding their information. But James already knew from his investigation that Reynolds didn't care much about what was reasonable or legal. Not when he'd made up his mind about someone. "Don't get smart with me," Reynolds snapped. His face was getting red now. "I've received reports about someone matching your description casing businesses in this area. Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Stand up and put your hands where I can see them." James felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. This was it. This was the exact pattern he'd documented. The vague reports, the refusal to explain. The immediate escalation to physical compliance. He'd read about this same scenario playing out 17 times in the past 2 years. Different people. Different locations. Same officer. Same tactics. The barista, a young woman with her hair tied back, stepped forward nervously. "Excuse me, officer?" "This gentleman has been coming here for weeks. He just sits and works on his computer. He's never caused any trouble." Reynolds didn't even look at her. "Ma'am, step back. This doesn't concern you." James slowly closed his laptop. He placed his hands flat on the table, fingers spread, completely visible. This was the moment where he had to make a choice. He could reveal who he was right now. Flash his FBI credentials. End this before it went further. The investigation might take a hit, but he'd be safe, or he could let this play out. Document exactly how Reynolds treated someone he perceived as just another black man who looked suspicious. Capture the behavior on tape. Make the case ironclad. I'm standing up, James said clearly, making sure his words were picked up by the wire. My hands are visible. I'm not reaching for anything. I'm complying with your instructions. He stood slowly, deliberately, every movement careful, every action by the book, because he knew that later, people would watch this. They'd analyze every second. And he needed to show that he'd done nothing, absolutely nothing, to provoke what was happening. Reynolds moved closer, stepping right into James's personal space. It was an intimidation tactic. James recognized it from the training videos, from the complaint reports, from the testimony of other victims. Get close, invade their space, make them feel threatened, turn around, put your hands on the table. Reynolds' hand moved to his belt, resting near his handcuffs now. Officer, I haven't broken any laws, James said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. I'm a customer in a coffee shop. I've been sitting here peacefully. Can you please explain what crime you think I've committed? Loitering. Suspicious behavior. Failure to comply with a lawful order. You want me to keep going? Reynolds' voice had an edge to it now, an anger that seemed way out of proportion to the situation. A man at a nearby table spoke up. He's been here less than an hour. That's not loitering. And he's been complying with everything you've said. Sir, I will ask you to leave if you interfere with police business, Reynolds shot back, his eyes never leaving James. James's partner's voice came through the earpiece again, more urgent this time. James, this is getting dangerous. You need to identify yourself. Right now. But James made his decision. He turned slowly, placing his hands on the table as instructed. His laptop sat there, still closed. His coffee, now cold, sat beside it. Everything normal. Everything peaceful. Everything legal. And then he felt Reynolds grab his arm. The grip was tight, unnecessarily tight. Fingers digging into his bicep with force designed to hurt, to control, to dominate. James kept his body relaxed, didn't resist, didn't pull away. He just let it happen. You're under arrest, Reynolds announced, pulling James's arm behind his back roughly. The motion was sharp enough that James felt a twinge in his shoulder. Loitering, suspicious behavior, and failure to comply with lawful police orders. The click of handcuffs was loud in the silent coffee shop. Metal against skin. Each click a violation. Each second another piece of evidence. James's mind was racing even as his body remained still. Reynolds hadn't read him his rights, hadn't properly identified what crime he'd actually witnessed, hadn't given James any chance to simply leave if loitering was really the concern. This is wrong, the barista called out. He didn't do anything. Several customers were definitely recording now, phones held up capturing everything. James was grateful for that. The more documentation, the better. His wire was getting every word, every sound. The FBI was listening. But these civilian videos would matter too. They'd show what happened from different angles, different perspectives. Reynolds pulled James away from the table, not bothering to let him grab his laptop or his belongings. Someone will collect your things, he said dismissively. As Reynolds marched him toward the door, James caught sight of his reflection in the glass. A black man in handcuffs being led out of a Starbucks by a white police officer. How many times had this scene played out across the country? How many times had someone innocent been humiliated, violated, arrested for nothing more than existing in a space where someone decided they didn't belong? But this time was different. This time the man in handcuffs was a federal agent. This time everything was being documented and transmitted. This time the officer doing the arresting was the subject of a months-long investigation into this exact behavior. The irony wasn't lost on James. He'd spent 3 months trying to prove that Officer Reynolds racially profiled people, that he arrested black men without cause, that he abused his authority. And now Reynolds was proving it himself, with James as the unwitting evidence. The door chimed as they walked out. The cool morning air hit James's face. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, people stopping to watch. Some looked shocked. Some looked sadly unsurprised, like they'd seen this before. A few shook their heads. Reynolds' patrol car sat at the curb, its presence now feeling less like protection and more like a threat. As Reynolds opened the back door and put his hand on James's head to guide him into the vehicle, James thought about all the people who'd sat in this same spot before him. All the people who'd been arrested by this same officer. All the people who'd had no power, no backup, no way to fight back against the injustice, but James did. And soon, very soon, Officer Reynolds was going to realize that this arrest was the biggest mistake of his career. The back seat of the patrol car smelled like old vinyl and disinfectant. James sat with his hands cuffed behind him, the metal digging into his wrists every time the car hit a bump. The position was deliberately uncomfortable, designed that way. His shoulder was already aching from how roughly Reynolds had twisted his arm. Through the metal grate separating the front and back seats, James could see the back of Reynolds's head. The officer was talking on his radio, voice low and confident, probably reporting his arrest, probably feeling pretty pleased with himself. James stayed quiet, his mind working through everything that had just happened. In law enforcement, they taught you to document everything mentally when you couldn't write it down. Times, actions, words, everything might matter later. Reynolds hadn't read him his Miranda rights. That was violation number 1. Every cop knew you had to read someone their rights when you arrested them. It was basic, elementary. But Reynolds had been so focused on making the arrest, so caught up in his own authority, that he'd skipped one of the most fundamental requirements. The car pulled away from the Starbucks, and James watched through the window as the coffee shop disappeared behind them. Somewhere in there, his laptop sat on that table, his coffee probably being cleaned up by now, his entire cover potentially blown. But none of that mattered as much as what was happening right now. "You know, you made this harder than it needed to be," Reynolds said from the front seat, his eyes meeting James's in the rearview mirror. "All I asked for was ID, simple request. But you had to make it complicated." James didn't respond. Another technique they taught in training. Don't engage unless you have to. Let them talk. Let them reveal themselves. "I see guys like you all the time," Reynolds continued, and there was something in his tone now, something ugly. "Think you're smart. Think you know your rights. Think you can just sit wherever you want, do whatever you want. But this is my neighborhood, my patrol area, and when I say someone looks suspicious, they're suspicious." Every word was being recorded. James's wire was still transmitting, still sending everything back to his partner. But hearing it directly was different than reading it in a report. The casual racism, the sense of ownership over public space, the belief that being a police officer meant you got to decide who belonged and who didn't. The car took a turn, and James shifted to keep his balance. The handcuffs bit into his wrists. He thought about the 17 other people who'd been in this same position. How scared they must have been. How powerless they must have felt. At least James knew this would end. Knew he had backup, knew justice would eventually come. They hadn't known any of that. "You married?" Reynolds asked suddenly. "Got kids?" James remained silent. "I've got 2 boys," Reynolds continued like they were having a normal conversation, like he wasn't talking to a man he'd just illegally arrested, teaching them right from wrong, teaching them to respect authority. That's what's wrong these days, you know? No respect. Everyone thinks they can just do whatever they want. The patrol car pulled into the station parking lot. James had never been to this particular precinct, but he'd studied the layout as part of his investigation. He knew where the holding cells were, where the processing area was, where the interview rooms were located. Knowledge that was about to become very personal. Reynolds parked and got out, taking his time. Through the window, James could see other officers coming and going. Some in uniform, some in plain clothes. Normal day at the precinct, except today was about to become very not normal. The back door opened and Reynolds reached in to pull James out. Not gentle, not careful, just a firm grip and a pull that was designed to be just rough enough to be uncomfortable, without being obvious brutality. James had seen this technique described in complaints. The kind of treatment that hurt but didn't leave marks. "Watch your head," Reynolds said, but he didn't actually help James avoid hitting the doorframe. James had to duck quickly to avoid a collision, his hands still cuffed behind him, making balance difficult. They walked toward the entrance, and James noticed a few officers glancing their way. Some looked curious. Some looked indifferent. This was routine for them. Just another arrest. Just another person being brought in. They had no idea what was really happening. Inside, the precinct was exactly what James expected. Fluorescent lights. Scuffed floors. That particular smell of coffee, sweat, and institutional cleaning supplies. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with graying hair, looked up as they entered. "What have you got, Reynolds?" he asked, already reaching for the processing paperwork. "Suspicious behavior, loitering, failure to comply," Reynolds rattled off. "Caught him casing businesses on 5th Street. Gave me attitude when I tried to question him." James noted each lie, each exaggeration. The record would show different. The videos from the coffee shop would show different. His wire recording would show different. But right now, in this moment, Reynolds' version was the only one that mattered to the people in this room. "Name?" the sergeant asked James directly. James looked at him steadily. "I want to make a phone call. That's my right." The sergeant glanced at Reynolds, then back to James. "You'll get your call. After processing. Name?" "I'm legally entitled to a phone call before questioning," James said calmly. He knew his rights better than probably anyone in this building. "I'm requesting that call now." Reynolds laughed. Actually laughed. "Listen to this guy. Thinks he's a lawyer or something. Just answer the questions and we'll get through this faster." "Am I being charged with a crime?" James asked. "You're under arrest." "I already told you that," Reynolds said, irritation creeping into his voice. "Then I'm entitled to know the specific charges, to have my rights read to me, and to make a phone call." "You've done none of those things." James kept his voice level, professional. He wasn't trying to antagonize. He was simply stating facts. The desk sergeant looked uncomfortable now. He'd been doing this job long enough to know when something didn't sound right. "Reynolds, did you read him his rights?" "I'll do it now," Reynolds said dismissively, pulling out a card from his pocket. He rushed through the Miranda warning like he was reading a grocery list, the words meaningless and mechanical, but it was too late. He should have done it at the moment of arrest. Any decent lawyer would get this thrown out in court, not that it would get that far. Not once James revealed who he really was. They moved him to a small room for processing. Fingerprints. Photos. The whole humiliating routine designed to strip away dignity and reinforce the power dynamic. Reynolds supervised it all, standing with his arms crossed, that satisfied look still on his face. James complied with everything. He gave his name when officially required for the paperwork. He let them take his fingerprints. He stood for the mugshot. But he didn't answer questions about where he lived, where he worked, or anything else. He just kept repeating that he wanted to make his phone call. After what felt like hours but was probably only about 90 minutes, they finally put him in a holding cell. A small room with concrete walls, a metal bench, and a toilet in the corner. The door clanged shut with a sound that echoed. James sat on the bench and took a slow, deep breath. His partner would be losing her mind by now. The FBI field office would be scrambling, but he'd made his choice. He'd let this play out as far as it needed to go, because every minute of illegal detention, every denied right, every violation of procedure was more evidence in a case that was already overwhelming. Through the small window in the door, he could see Reynolds talking with other officers in the hallway, laughing about something, probably telling war stories, probably feeling like he'd done good police work today. James looked down at his hands that were still sore from the too tight handcuffs, hands that belonged to an FBI agent who'd just been illegally arrested, denied his rights, and humiliated, all because of the color of his skin. He'd spent 3 months investigating this officer, 3 months documenting patterns and building a case, and now he'd become part of that case in the most direct way possible. It was time to end this. Time to reveal who he really was and watch Reynolds' world come crashing down. James stood up and walked to the door. "Officer," he called out, "I need to speak with whoever's in charge. Right now. Because I'm Special Agent James Mitchell with the FBI and you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." The hallway outside the holding cell went quiet. James could see Reynolds through the small window, frozen mid-conversation with another officer. The smile had vanished from his face. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Reynolds walked quickly to the cell door. "What did you just say?" "I'm FBI Special Agent James Mitchell," James repeated clearly, his voice carrying down the hallway. "My credentials are in the inside pocket of my jacket. The jacket you took from me without a warrant. I've been conducting a federal investigation into civil rights violations, and you've just committed multiple federal offenses against a federal agent. Every single thing that's happened in the last 2 hours has been recorded and transmitted in real time to my team." The color drained from Reynolds' face. He looked like someone had just told him his house was on fire. The other officer, a younger guy with a crew cut, took a step back, his eyes wide. "You're lying," Reynolds said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "If you were FBI, you would have said something. You would have shown your badge." "Why would I do that?" James asked calmly. "I was sitting in a coffee shop conducting lawful surveillance as part of an authorized federal investigation. You approached me. You demanded my identification without reasonable suspicion. You arrested me without probable cause. You failed to read me my Miranda rights at the time of arrest. You denied me my right to a phone call. Everything you did was illegal. And the fact that I'm a federal agent makes it exponentially worse for you." The desk sergeant appeared in the hallway, moving faster than his size suggested he could. "What's going on here?" "He claims he's FBI," Reynolds said, but the word claim sounded weak, desperate. "I don't claim anything," James said. "Sergeant, my name is James Mitchell, badge number 7734. I'm assigned to the Civil Rights Division of the FBI's field office downtown. You can verify this with one phone call. My credentials are in my jacket, which Officer Reynolds confiscated. My service weapon is also in that jacket. I suggest you retrieve both immediately and contact my supervisor." The sergeant's face had gone from curious to deeply worried. He'd been around long enough to know when something had gone very, very wrong. "Get his belongings. Now," he ordered Reynolds. Reynolds stood there for a moment like his feet were stuck to the floor. Then he turned and practically ran down the hallway. "Open this cell," the sergeant said to the younger officer, his voice tight. The door swung open, and James stepped out. He could feel eyes on him from every direction now. Other officers had appeared, drawn by the commotion. Everyone was staring. Everyone had heard what he'd said. Reynolds returned carrying James's jacket, his hands actually shaking. The sergeant took it and carefully reached into the inside pocket. His face went pale as he pulled out the leather credential case. He opened it slowly, like he was hoping it would somehow be fake, some kind of joke. But there it was. The gold FBI badge. The official identification card with James's photo and signature. "Oh my God," the sergeant whispered. He pulled out James's phone next, and his service weapon, a standard-issue Glock that every FBI agent carried. The sergeant's hands were steady, but James could see the tension in his jaw, the way his throat moved as he swallowed hard. "I need to make a call," James said quietly. "Several calls, actually." "Yes, sir, of course. Right away." The sergeant's whole demeanor had changed. The casual authority was gone, replaced by the careful politeness of someone who knew they were in the presence of a disaster. "Please come with me." "Reynolds, don't move. Don't go anywhere. Don't touch anything." Reynolds stood in the hallway like a statue. His face had gone from white to red. His jaw clenched so tight James could see the muscles jumping. The other officers backed away from him like he was radioactive. Nobody wanted to be associated with what had just happened. The sergeant led James to a private office. "Sir, I had no idea." "If I'd known—" "You should have known something was wrong," James interrupted, not unkindly. "An arrest with no real probable cause. Miranda rights not read at the scene. A phone call denied. These are basic violations whether I'm FBI or not. They would have been just as illegal if I was a regular citizen." The sergeant had no answer for that. He handed James his phone and quietly left the office, closing the door behind him. James sat down and took a moment. His wrists were sore. His shoulders still ached. But mostly he felt a strange mix of anger and satisfaction. Anger at what had happened. Satisfaction that he'd documented exactly what he'd been investigating. He dialed his partner's number first. She answered before the first ring finished. "James, are you okay? We've been listening to everything. The whole team is mobilized. We're 5 minutes from your location." "I'm fine," James said. "Stay where you are for now." "I'm about to call the field office. We need to do this by the book. Every step documented. Every procedure followed. Did you get it all?" she asked. "Please tell me the wire caught everything. Every word. Every action. Everything." James looked down at his wrists at the red marks from the handcuffs. He did exactly what we've been documenting. But this time he did it to a federal agent. On tape, with witnesses. It's over. His next call was to his supervisor. That conversation was shorter, more formal. Confirming his status. Reporting the incident. Requesting immediate response from the FBI's legal team and Internal Affairs Division. Within minutes, the wheels of federal law enforcement were turning. The door opened and a man in a suit walked in. Older, with gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much.
Agent Mitchell?
I'm Captain Rodriguez. I'm the watch commander here. James stood and shook his hand. Captain, I've been briefed on the situation. I want you to know that Officer Reynolds has been suspended immediately, pending investigation. I've also contacted our Internal Affairs Division and the city's Civilian Oversight Board. This is being taken very seriously. It should be, James said, but you should also know this isn't just about today. I've been investigating Officer Reynolds for 3 months. Today's incident is just the culmination of a pattern that goes back years. The captain's face somehow got even more grim. Years? I have documentation of 17 similar incidents. Arrests without cause. Rights violations. A clear pattern of targeting individuals based on race. Today he just happened to target a federal agent. But there are 17 other people who went through the same thing I did. Except they didn't have backup listening in. They didn't have FBI credentials to make it stop. They just had to endure it. Rodriguez sat down heavily in a chair. This is going to be a nightmare. It already was a nightmare, James corrected. For the people Reynolds victimized, now it's just finally going to be addressed. There was a knock on the door. The desk sergeant stuck his head in. Captain, the FBI field office has arrived. And there are reporters outside. Someone must have heard the scanner traffic. James wasn't surprised. Police scanners were public. And an FBI agent being arrested by the officer he was investigating, that was the kind of story that spread fast. Tell the FBI agents they can come in and get someone on crowd control outside. No statements to press until we have our story straight. The captain looked at James. Though I suppose the real story is yours to tell. The real story is in the evidence, James said. Body camera footage, my wire recording, witness statements from the coffee shop, civilian cell phone videos. This isn't about he said, she said. This is documented fact. The next few hours were a blur of statements, reports, and coordination between agencies. James's partner arrived with the FBI legal team. They secured all the evidence, including Reynolds' body camera footage, which the officer had conveniently forgotten to turn on. That in itself was another violation of department policy. The police department's internal affairs showed up. The district attorney's office sent a representative. Everyone wanted to understand what had happened, to contain the damage, to figure out their exposure. But through it all, James kept coming back to one thought. This wasn't really about him. Yes, he'd been arrested. Yes, his rights had been violated. But he was going to be fine. He had resources, support, and power. The 17 other people who'd been targeted by Reynolds, they hadn't had any of that. They'd been humiliated, arrested, charged with crimes they didn't commit. Some had lost jobs. Some had gotten criminal records. Some had just learned to live with the knowledge that the police could do this to them anytime, anywhere for any reason. As James finally left the precinct that evening, he saw Reynolds being escorted out a side entrance. Their eyes met for just a moment. Reynolds looked defeated, scared, and angry all at once. But he didn't say anything. What could he say? James got into his car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. His phone buzzed with messages. His supervisor. His colleagues. Friends who'd heard the news. Everyone checking in. Everyone wanting to know what happened. But James was thinking about tomorrow. About the press conference that would need to happen. About the 17 other cases that would need to be reviewed. About the systemic changes that would need to follow. Today had been about one officer and one arrest. Tomorrow would be about justice for everyone who'd been silenced for too long, and James was ready for that fight. By 6 o'clock that evening, the story was everywhere. James sat in the FBI field office conference room, watching the news coverage spread across multiple screens. His phone had been ringing nonstop for hours. FBI agent arrested by cop he was investigating, read one headline. Federal agent racially profiled during undercover investigation, read another. The story had that perfect combination of irony and injustice that made it impossible to ignore. The video from the Starbucks was already online. Multiple angles from different customers' phones all showing the same thing. A man sitting peacefully with his coffee. A police officer approaching aggressively. An arrest that looked wrong from every angle. The footage was grainy, shot on cell phones, but the story it told was crystal clear. James's supervisor, Director Patricia Chen, sat across from him with her laptop open. She'd been with the FBI for 23 years and had seen a lot of things, But even she looked shaken by how fast this was moving. "The Attorney General's office has been calling," she said. "So has the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. The mayor's office. 2 senators. Everyone wants to know what happened and what we're going to do about it." "What happened is that Officer Reynolds did exactly what I'd been documenting for 3 months," James said. "The only difference is this time he did it to me." Patricia looked up from her screen. "The district attorney wants to prosecute. They're talking about deprivation of rights under color of law, false arrest, assault on a federal officer. Reynolds could be looking at serious prison time." James nodded slowly. He'd known this was coming. "What about the other cases? The 17 people he targeted before me?" "That's where this gets complicated." Patricia closed her laptop and leaned forward. "Your case is solid. Rock solid. We have video, audio, witnesses, everything. But the older cases? Some of them are 2-3 years old. Evidence is weaker. Witnesses have moved away. It's going to be harder to prosecute those. But we can still try to make things right," James said. It wasn't a question. "We can and we will. The DA's office is already reviewing every arrest Reynolds made in the past 5 years. Anyone who was charged based solely on his testimony, those cases are being reopened. But James, you need to understand something. This is going to get big. Really big." As if on cue, James's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. A reporter from a major national news network. The 15th media request in the last hour. "They want you to tell your story," Patricia continued. "The press. The public. Everyone wants to hear from the FBI agent who got arrested. But we need to be strategic about this. We need to control the narrative." "The narrative controls itself," James said. "The evidence speaks for itself. Reynolds arrested me without cause, violated my rights, and did it all because of how I look. That's the story. That's the truth." His partner knocked on the conference room door and stuck her head in. "Sorry to interrupt. James, there are people gathering outside the precinct. Community members. They heard what happened, and they're demanding answers. Some of them are saying Reynolds arrested their family members too." James wasn't surprised. He'd read the files. He'd seen the names. Tyrell Johnson arrested for looking suspicious outside his own apartment building. David Washington arrested for asking why he was being stopped. Kevin Brown arrested for matching a description that was so vague it could have fit 1 million people. "They're finally speaking up because they think someone will listen now," James said quietly. "Because an FBI agent was involved. But they've been trying to speak up for years." Patricia stood up. "Then let's make sure they're heard. James, I want you to take point on this investigation. You've been building the case. You know it better than anyone. And after what happened today, you've earned the right to see it through." Over the next several days, James's life became a whirlwind. The FBI opened a formal civil rights investigation into the entire police department, not just Reynolds. They were looking at supervision, training, complaint handling, everything. How had one officer gotten away with this pattern for so long? Who had protected him? Who had ignored the warning signs? The answers, when they started coming, were disturbing. Reynolds had friends in high places. A lieutenant who'd dismissed complaints without investigation. A union representative who'd threatened witnesses. A system that had been designed to protect officers, even bad ones, at the expense of the community they were supposed to serve. James spent hours interviewing the people Reynolds had targeted. Sitting in their living rooms, hearing their stories, watching them cry or get angry or just look exhausted. Each story was different in its details, but the same in its essence. Disrespect, violation, powerlessness. Tyrell Johnson invited James to his small apartment on the south side. He was 26, worked 2 jobs, and had no criminal record before Reynolds arrested him. "I was coming home from work," Tyrell explained, sitting on his worn couch, "just walking up to my building. And this cop car pulls up. Reynolds gets out and starts asking me what I'm doing here. I told him I live here. He didn't believe me. Said I matched a description of someone who'd been breaking into cars." "Did he say what description?" James asked, already knowing the answer. "Black male, medium height, dark clothing." Tyrell laughed bitterly. "That's half the guys in this neighborhood. But he arrested me anyway, took me in. I spent 6 hours in a cell before they finally let me go. No charges, no apology, nothing. And I missed my shift at work. Got written up for it too." "Did you file a complaint?" "Yeah. Got a letter 2 months later saying the complaint was unfounded, that Reynolds had acted appropriately. Made me feel like I was crazy, like I'd imagined the whole thing. James heard similar stories over and over. David Washington had been arrested during a routine traffic stop that had escalated for no reason. Kevin Brown had been arrested at a shopping mall where he'd been waiting for his girlfriend. The pattern was undeniable, and the department's response had been to protect the officer and dismiss the victims. The media coverage intensified. James did one carefully managed interview with a national news program, explaining what had happened and why it mattered. He chose his words carefully, staying factual, avoiding anything that could be seen as inflammatory. But the story didn't need any embellishment. A federal agent investigating racial profiling gets racially profiled by the officer he's investigating. You couldn't make that up. It was too perfectly ironic, too obviously unjust. Social media exploded with reactions. Hashtags trending, debates raging. Some people defended Reynolds, saying he was just doing his job, that James should have identified himself immediately. But most people saw it for what it was, a clear case of racial profiling, made even more egregious by who the victim turned out to be. The police union issued a statement defending Reynolds. Officer Reynolds has served this community with distinction for 12 years. This appears to be a misunderstanding that has been blown out of proportion. We ask that everyone wait for all the facts before rushing to judgment. James read the statement and shook his head. All the facts were already out there. Video evidence, audio recordings, witness testimony, documentation of a years-long pattern. What more facts did they need? But he understood what was really happening. The union was circling the wagons, protecting their own. It was the same instinct that had let Reynolds get away with this behavior for so long. The thin blue line, the code of silence, the belief that admitting one officer was wrong meant admitting the whole system might be flawed. 2 weeks after the arrest, the FBI held a press conference. James stood at the podium with Director Chen beside him and the U.S. Attorney on the other side. Behind them were photos. 17 photos of 17 people, the faces of everyone Reynolds had targeted. Today, we're announcing federal civil rights charges against Officer Derek Reynolds, the U.S. Attorney said. We're also announcing a comprehensive investigation into systemic issues within the police department. But most importantly, we're here to say to every person who was victimized by Officer Reynolds, who filed complaints that were ignored, who tried to speak up but weren't heard, we believe you. We see you, and we're going to fight for justice. James stepped to the microphone. The camera flashes were blinding. Reporters leaned forward with their recorders. 3 months ago, I started investigating complaints about racial profiling, James said. I never imagined I would become part of my own investigation. But what happened to me happens to people every single day in this country. The only difference is that I had a badge and backup. Most people don't have that. They just have to endure the violation and hope someone believes them. He gestured to the photos behind him. These are the people who matter in this case. Not me, them. They were targeted. They were violated. They were ignored. Today we start making that right. The questions from reporters came fast and heated. How long had this been going on? Would other officers be charged? What about the supervisors who dismissed the complaints? James answered what he could, deferred what he couldn't. But one question stopped him cold. A reporter from a local paper asked, Agent Mitchell, do you think this would have become a federal case if you hadn't been the one arrested? If it had been Tyrell Johnson or David Washington or Kevin Brown in that Starbucks instead of an FBI agent? The federal courthouse was packed on the first day of Officer Reynolds' trial. James arrived early, avoiding the crowd of reporters and protesters gathered outside. Some held signs supporting Reynolds. Back the blue and stop the war on police. Others held signs demanding justice, Black Lives Matter, and hold cops accountable. The divide was sharp and visible. Inside, the courtroom was equally tense. Reynolds sat at the defense table with his lawyers, 3 expensive attorneys hired by the police union. He wore a suit instead of his uniform, probably a tactical choice to make him look less like a cop and more like a regular person. But James could still see the arrogance in his posture, the set of his jaw that said he still thought he'd done nothing wrong. The charges were serious. Deprivation of rights under color of law, false arrest, assault on a federal officer. Each one carried years in prison. Together, they could put Reynolds away for a long time. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They started with James's testimony. He spent 4 hours on the stand walking through every detail of that morning. The surveillance he'd been conducting, Reynolds' aggressive approach, the arrest without cause, the violations that followed. The defense attorney tried to poke holes in his story. Agent Mitchell, isn't it true that you deliberately didn't identify yourself? That you let this situation escalate when you could have stopped it at any time? James met his eyes steadily. I was conducting lawful surveillance in a public place. I had no obligation to identify myself to anyone. Officer Reynolds approached me without reasonable suspicion. He demanded my identification without legal cause. He arrested me without probable cause. At no point was I required to reveal that I was a federal agent. The fact that I was FBI doesn't change whether his actions were legal. They weren't. But you could have prevented your own arrest, the attorney pressed. Yes. Just like every person Officer Reynolds has ever targeted could have prevented their arrest by being white. The point isn't what I could have done. The point is what he shouldn't have done, the courtroom murmured. The judge called for order. Next came the video evidence. The Starbucks surveillance footage played on screens throughout the courtroom. Everyone watched as Reynolds approached James's table, as he demanded identification, as he escalated the situation. The audio wasn't great, but you could hear enough. The aggressive tone, the lack of justification, then the civilian cell phone videos, multiple angles all showing the same thing, James sitting calmly, hands visible, complying with every instruction, and Reynolds grabbing him roughly, handcuffing him, leading him out while James had done absolutely nothing illegal. The prosecution played James's wire recording. The courtroom listened to every word from the patrol car. Reynolds' comments, his casual racism, his sense of ownership over public space. You could see some of the jurors' faces change as they listened. See them realize this wasn't just about one bad arrest. This was about a pattern of thinking, a worldview that saw certain people as inherently suspicious. But the prosecution didn't stop with James. They brought in the other victims. Tyrell Johnson testified about his arrest. His voice shook slightly as he described being handcuffed outside his own apartment building, being told he looked suspicious in his own neighborhood. "Did you file a complaint?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes, sir. Got a letter saying it was unfounded. That Officer Reynolds acted appropriately." Tyrell's voice was bitter, made me feel like I was the problem. Like I was crazy for thinking something was wrong. David Washington testified next, then Kevin Brown, then others. One after another, they told their stories. Different details, same pattern. Stopped without reason, treated with disrespect, arrested on vague charges that were later dropped, and complaints that went nowhere. The defense tried to argue that these were separate incidents, that each one had to be judged individually. But the pattern was too clear. The same officer, the same behavior, the same type of victims, the same outcomes. James sat in the gallery and watched as the defense attorney questioned Tyrell Johnson. "Mr. Johnson, had you been drinking on the night of your arrest?" "I had one beer after work, one. And Officer Reynolds noted in his report that you appeared intoxicated." "I wasn't intoxicated. I'd had one beer 3 hours earlier." Tyrell's frustration was evident. He said that to justify the arrest. But the breathalyzer at the station showed I was under the legal limit. Way under. But Officer Reynolds had reasonable suspicion to investigate. Reasonable suspicion of what? Walking while black? Being in my own neighborhood? The judge sustained the prosecution's objection, but the point had been made. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution brought expert witnesses who testified about racial profiling. They brought statistics showing that Reynolds had arrested black men at a rate 17 times higher than white men, despite patrolling a diverse area. They brought evidence that Reynolds had consistently used vague justifications for his arrests. Matched a description. Appeared suspicious. Behavior consistent with criminal activity. The defense argued that Reynolds was a good cop making tough decisions in difficult situations. That he'd received commendations. That he'd served his community for 12 years. That this prosecution was politically motivated, an overreaction to one misunderstanding. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of false arrest?" "Guilty." "On the charge of assault on a federal officer?" "Guilty." Reynolds' face went white. His lawyers looked stunned. The courtroom erupted in noise, some people cheering, others gasping, everyone reacting. The judge called for order, his gavel banging repeatedly. James felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, but also sadness. Because this should never have gotten this far. Reynolds should have been stopped years ago after the first complaint, the second, the third. But the system had protected him. And now, finally, he was being held accountable. After the verdict, James stood outside the courthouse with Tyrell, David, Kevin, and others. Reporters surrounded them, asking for reactions. "Justice was served today," Tyrell said. "But we shouldn't forget all the time it took. All the complaints that were ignored. All the people who tried to speak up and weren't heard. This is one victory. But we need real change." A reporter turned to James. "Agent Mitchell, how do you feel about the verdict?" "I feel like this is the beginning, not the end," James said. "Officer Reynolds has been held accountable. That's important. But the system that protected him for so long still exists. The culture that dismissed complaints, that dismissed victims, that chose to believe the officer over community members every single time, that needs to change too." What needs to happen next? James thought about the months of investigation, the hours spent reviewing complaints that had been marked unfounded, the witnesses who'd been afraid to speak up because they knew no one would believe them, the pattern of behavior that had been documented and ignored repeatedly. "We need real oversight," he said. "Independent review of complaints. Body cameras that can't be turned off. Consequences for officers who abuse their power. And most importantly, we need to start believing people when they say they've been mistreated. We need to stop automatically assuming the officer is right and the citizen is lying." The sentencing hearing was set for 2 months later. When that day came, Reynolds stood before the judge and was given 8 years in federal prison. He was also permanently banned from working in law enforcement anywhere in the country. James was there when the sentence was read. He watched Reynolds being led away in handcuffs, the same handcuffs Reynolds had put on him and so many others. There was a certain poetic justice in that. But as James left the courthouse that day, he wasn't thinking about Reynolds. He was thinking about all the people who'd been targeted, who'd been violated, who'd tried to get justice and been denied. He was thinking about how the system had failed them until the system itself became a victim. And he was thinking about what came next. Because prosecuting one officer was important, but changing a culture, fixing a broken system, creating real accountability, that was the hard part. That was the work that would take years, maybe decades. 6 months after Reynolds' sentencing, James sat in a conference room with the police department's new reform committee. The room was crowded. Police press, community leaders, civil rights advocates, city council members, everyone who'd been brought together to figure out how to fix what had been broken for so long. The federal consent decree had been in place for 3 months now. It was a legally binding agreement that required the department to make sweeping changes to how they operated. Body camera policies, use of force standards, complaint procedures, bias training. Dozens of reforms, all designed to prevent another Officer Reynolds from slipping through the cracks. "The problem," said one community leader, a woman named Patricia who ran a youth center on the south side, "is that we've been here before. After every scandal, there are promises of reform. New policies, new training, but nothing really changes. How is this time different?" It was a fair question. James had studied the history. There had been other scandals, other promises, other reform initiatives. Some changes had been made, but the core culture had remained the same. "This time is different because the oversight is external," said the federal monitor, a retired judge named Thompson, who'd been appointed to oversee the reforms. "I report directly to the federal court. If the department doesn't comply, there are consequences. Real consequences." The police chief, a new appointment who'd been brought in after the previous chief resigned, nodded. "We're committed to transparency. We're committed to accountability, and we're committed to rebuilding trust with the community." James had heard similar words before, but he'd also seen the initial data from the new complaint system, and it gave him hope. In 3 months, they'd received more complaints than they had in the previous 3 years. Not because things were worse, but because people finally believed someone might actually listen. Each complaint was now reviewed by an independent board that included community members. Officers couldn't investigate themselves anymore. Body cameras were mandatory and couldn't be turned off without a documented reason. and officers who violated policies faced real discipline, not just a slap on the wrist. The reforms were comprehensive. Every officer in the department had to go through implicit bias training. Not a one-hour seminar, but a real program that forced them to confront their assumptions and biases. Some officers resisted. Some complained that they were being treated like criminals, but most recognized that change was necessary. New hiring standards were put in place. Recruits were screened more carefully for signs of bias or aggressive tendencies. The academy training was overhauled to emphasize de-escalation and community policing, rather than warrior mentality. The department also started tracking data in new ways. Every traffic stop, every arrest, every use of force incident, all broken down by race, age, and location. The data would be public, analyzed regularly for patterns that might indicate bias. James worked closely with the reform team, sharing insights from his investigation. He helped design the new complaint process, making sure it was accessible and actually worked. He helped train officers on how to recognize and address their own biases. But the real test came when the new systems had to work in practice. One day, James got a call from the Civilian Oversight Board. They'd received a complaint about an officer named Rodriguez, who'd allegedly made racially insensitive comments during a traffic stop. Under the old system, this probably would have been dismissed. But now it triggered a real investigation. James reviewed the body camera footage. Rodriguez had pulled over a black driver for a broken taillight. The stop had started professionally enough, but then Rodriguez had made a comment about your people needing to take better care of their vehicles. It wasn't overtly racist, but it was inappropriate. It revealed an underlying bias. Under the new system, Rodriguez was required to attend additional training. He was also assigned to work with a community liaison for 3 months to better understand the impact of his words. It wasn't a firing, it wasn't a prosecution, but it was real accountability. A recognition that the behavior was wrong and needed to be corrected. More importantly, the driver who'd filed the complaint received a real response. Not a form letter saying his complaint was unfounded, but an actual explanation of what had happened, what was being done about it, and an apology from the department. The changes weren't just about policies. They were about culture. And culture change is slow and difficult. James knew that from experience. He still got calls from people in the community. Some were positive, thanking him for what he'd done, telling him they'd noticed improvements in how officers treated them. Others were skeptical, saying the reforms were just for show, that nothing had really changed. Tyrell Johnson called one day. "I got pulled over last week," he said. James's stomach tightened. "What happened?" "That's the thing. It was normal. The officer was polite, explained why he stopped me, gave me a warning for my registration being expired. No attitude, no assumptions, just how it should be." "That's good," James said. "Yeah, but it shouldn't be remarkable, you know? The fact that I'm calling you to tell you about a normal traffic stop because it went well, that shows how messed up things have been." He was right. The standard shouldn't be officers who don't violate rights. That should be the baseline. The standard should be officers who actively build trust, who see themselves as part of the community, not as an occupying force. James also tracked what happened to the people Reynolds had targeted. The 17 cases that had been reopened. Some had been completely dismissed, records expunged. Others had been reduced to lesser charges. All of them received financial settlements from the city. But the money didn't erase what they'd been through. David Washington told James that he still felt anxious every time he saw a police car. Kevin Brown said he'd moved to a different neighborhood because he couldn't feel safe in his own community anymore. The trauma lingered even after the legal issues were resolved. The department started a victim services program as part of the reforms, offering counseling and support to people who'd been impacted by police misconduct. It was a small gesture, but it recognized something important. That police abuse didn't just violate legal rights, it violated human dignity. And healing from that required more than just legal remedies. A year after the arrest at Starbucks, James was invited to speak at the police academy's graduation. Standing in front of 70 new officers, he told them his story. The investigation, the arrest, the trial, the reforms that followed. "Every one of you is about to take an oath," he said. "You're going to swear to protect and serve, to uphold the Constitution, to treat everyone with dignity and respect. Those aren't just words. They're a sacred responsibility. And when you violate that oath, when you let your biases or your ego or your fear drive your actions instead of your training and your values, you don't just hurt the person you're targeting. You hurt everyone. You hurt your fellow officers. You hurt your community. You hurt the very idea of justice. He looked out at the young faces. Some looked inspired. Some looked defensive. Some looked uncertain. Officer Reynolds was a good cop once, James continued. He had commendations. He'd done good work. But somewhere along the way, he started taking shortcuts, started making assumptions, started letting bias drive his decisions, and nobody stopped him. His supervisors didn't stop him. His fellow officers didn't stop him. The system protected him instead of correcting him. And eventually, those small compromises became major violations. Don't let that be your story. After the ceremony, several new officers approached James. They had questions about bias, about accountability, about how to be the kind of officer their community could trust. One young woman, Officer Chen, asked, "What if I see another officer doing something wrong? Something that violates someone's rights? What do I do?" It was the question that mattered most, because real reform didn't just come from policies and oversight. It came from officers holding each other accountable, from good cops refusing to cover for bad ones. "You speak up," James said. "I know that's hard. I know there's pressure to stay loyal, to protect your fellow officers. But real loyalty means stopping someone before they destroy their career and hurt people. Real loyalty means being willing to be uncomfortable in the moment to prevent disaster later." The reforms were working, slowly, imperfectly, but working. Complaint numbers were up, but sustained complaints were being addressed. Use of force incidents were down. Community surveys showed increasing trust in the department. It wasn't perfect. There were still problems, still incidents, still officers who resisted change. But the trajectory was different now. The culture was shifting. And most importantly, when problems did occur, there were systems in place to address them. James knew this was just one city, just one department. Across the country, there were thousands of other departments with their own problems, their own Reynoldses, their own systems that protected bad officers at the expense of the community. But change had to start somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, what had happened here could be a model for somewhere else. Maybe the next city wouldn't need an FBI agent to get arrested before they took complaints seriously. Maybe they could learn from this and do better from the start. 2 years after that morning at Starbucks, James found himself back in the same coffee shop. Same location, same window seat. But everything felt different now. The place had become something of a landmark. People sometimes stopped by just to see where it happened, where an FBI agent had been arrested by the corrupt cop he was investigating, where cell phone videos had captured injustice that sparked real change. The manager had considered putting up a plaque, but James had talked her out of it. This wasn't about creating a monument. It was about creating a better future. James ordered his usual, large black coffee, no sugar. The barista, the same young woman who'd witnessed his arrest, smiled as she handed it to him. "On the house, as always," she said. "You know, I still think about that day sometimes. How scared I was. How angry. How helpless I felt." "You weren't helpless," James said. "You spoke up. You tried to stop it. That mattered." "Did it, though? He arrested you anyway. But you were a witness. Your testimony mattered in court. And more than that, you were willing to see something wrong and say something. That's not nothing." James took his coffee and sat by the window. He pulled out his laptop, but before opening it, he looked out at the street. A patrol car drove past. New officers, new training, new accountability. Things weren't perfect, but they were better. His phone buzzed. A text from Tyrell Johnson. "Got accepted to the Citizens Police Academy. Gonna learn about law enforcement from the inside." Who would have thought? James smiled. The Citizens Police Academy was one of the reform initiatives. Regular people could go through a shortened version of police training, learn about use of force decisions, understand the challenges officers faced. It built bridges, created understanding. Tyrell, who'd been illegally arrested by Reynolds, was now volunteering to better understand policing. That was growth. Another text came through, this one from David Washington. "Just got promoted at work. Couldn't have happened if I still had that arrest on my record. Thanks for everything." These messages meant more to James than any commendation or award, because this was what justice actually looked like. Not just punishment for the wrongdoer, but restoration for the victims, people getting their lives back, people moving forward instead of being held back by injustice. James had been promoted too. He was now supervising the FBI's Civil Rights Division for the entire region. His case against Reynolds had established his reputation as someone who wouldn't back down from difficult investigations, someone who understood systemic problems and how to address them. But the work had gotten harder in some ways, because now everyone knew who he was. When he showed up to investigate a department, officers got nervous, defensive, sometimes hostile. They saw him as the guy who'd brought down one of their own. They didn't see that Reynolds had brought himself down. Still, James approached each case the same way. With thorough documentation, with fairness, with a focus on patterns rather than isolated incidents, because the goal wasn't to punish police departments, it was to make them better, to protect both communities and good officers by weeding out the bad ones. The Reynolds case had opened doors to other investigations. James had uncovered similar patterns in 3 other departments in the region. None as extensive as Reynolds, but troubling nonetheless. Each investigation led to reforms. Each reform made communities a little bit safer, a little more just. He'd also become a reluctant public figure. He got invited to speak at conferences, to train other law enforcement agencies, to consult on reform initiatives. He'd testified before Congress about racial profiling and police accountability. He'd been interviewed by national media dozens of times. James didn't particularly enjoy the attention. He was an investigator at heart. He preferred working cases to giving speeches. But he recognized that his platform gave him an opportunity to advocate for change on a larger scale. So he did the interviews. He gave the speeches. He shared the lessons learned from his case. One of those lessons was about the importance of documentation. If he hadn't been wearing a wire that day, if there hadn't been cell phone videos, if the Starbucks hadn't had security cameras, Reynolds might have gotten away with it. His word against James's. And in those situations, the officer's word usually won. That's why body cameras mattered. Why civilian oversight mattered. Why independent investigations mattered. Because without documentation, without accountability, the system defaulted to protecting itself. Another lesson was about the danger of small compromises. Reynolds hadn't started his career as a corrupt cop, but he'd made small compromises along the way. A traffic stop based on a hunch that was really based on bias. An arrest that was technically legal but morally wrong. A complaint dismissed because it was easier than investigating. Each small compromise made the next one easier, until he'd crossed lines he never thought he would. James thought about this whenever he faced ethical choices in his own work. The temptation to cut corners, to take the easy path, to let something slide because addressing it would be complicated. He understood how easy it was to rationalize small violations. That's why he held himself to strict standards. Because he knew where small compromises could lead. The coffee shop door chimed and an elderly black man walked in. He glanced at James, did a double take, and walked over. "You're Agent Mitchell, aren't you? The one who was arrested here?" James nodded. "Yes, sir. I just wanted to thank you. My grandson was arrested by that officer a few years back, charged with trespassing at a park, his own neighborhood park where he'd played since he was a kid. The charges got dropped eventually, but the arrest stayed on his record. Made it hard for him to get jobs. After your case, they expunged it. He got hired last month as an apprentice electrician, got his life back on track." The man's eyes were wet. "You gave my grandson his future back." "Thank you." James stood and shook his hand. "I'm glad the system finally worked for him. I'm sorry it took so long." After the man left, James sat back down and stared at his laptop screen. These moments happened occasionally. Someone recognizing him, sharing how the case had impacted their life. It was humbling and inspiring and sad all at once. Humbling because he was just one person doing his job. Inspiring because the work had mattered. Sad because so many people had been hurt before anything changed. His phone rang. His supervisor. "James, we've got a new case. A department 3 states over. Pattern of excessive force complaints. Sound familiar?" "Too familiar," James said. "Send me the files. I'll start reviewing tonight." Because the work never really ended. For every officer Reynolds who got held accountable, there were others who hadn't been caught yet. For every department that reformed, there were others still operating under broken systems. But James was committed to the work. Not just because it was his job, but because he'd experienced firsthand what it felt like to be targeted, to be violated, to have your rights ignored. He knew what it felt like to be handcuffed and helpless, to be treated as guilty until proven innocent, to be judged by the color of your skin rather than the content of your character. The difference was that he'd had power to fight back. He'd had resources, backup, authority. Most people didn't, so he'd use his power on their behalf. He'd be the voice for people who'd been silenced. He'd investigate the cases that had been dismissed. He'd hold accountable the officers who'd thought they were untouchable. As James finished his coffee and packed up his laptop, he took one last look around the Starbucks. This place where his life had changed, where injustice had been documented and ultimately addressed, where one officer's prejudice had collided with one agent's determination to expose it. The barista waved as he left. "See you next week?" "Same time, same place," James confirmed, because he wasn't going to let what happened chase him away. Wasn't going to let fear or anger or trauma dictate his life. He'd keep coming back to this coffee shop, keep sitting in this same spot, keep doing his work. Outside, the city moved around him. People going about their lives. Police officers on patrol. A community trying to heal and move forward. It wasn't perfect. Probably never would be. But it was better than it had been 2 years ago. And with continued work, continued vigilance, continued commitment to justice, it would keep getting better. James walked to his car, thinking about the new case waiting for him. Another investigation. Another chance to make things right. Another opportunity to ensure that what happened to him, what happened to Tyrell and David and Kevin and so many others, wouldn't keep happening. The work was hard. The progress was slow. The resistance was real. But so was the change. And that made it all worthwhile. As he drove away, James passed a group of teenagers walking down the sidewalk. They were laughing, carefree, not looking over their shoulders, not worried about being stopped for no reason, not scared of the police car that passed them without a second glance. Maybe they didn't know how much had changed. Maybe they didn't know about Officer Reynolds or the reforms or the investigation that had started in a coffee shop. Maybe they didn't need to know. Maybe the best measure of success wasn't how much people knew about what had been fixed. Maybe it was how many people could just live their lives without fear, without being judged, without being targeted.